In the summer of 1960, a construction worker named Randy Wickline stood at the edge of what he would later describe as an abyss, a massive excavation pit carved into the hillside next to the Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. Wickline worked for Superior Supply Company, and his job was straightforward: haul concrete to the construction site. But what troubled him was the scale of the operation. Over the next 2.5 years, his company would pour approximately 50,000 tons of concrete into that pit, constructing walls so thick and reinforced with so much steel that their purpose seemed unmistakable. Nobody came out and said it was a bomb shelter, Wickline would recall decades later, but they weren't building it to keep the rain off them. A fool would have known. What Wickline was helping to build, what almost no one except the highest levels of government knew about, was a classified emergency relocation facility designed to house the entire United States Congress in the event of nuclear war. The bunker beneath the Greenbrier would remain secret for 34 years, maintained by undercover government employees who posed as television repair technicians, ready to shelter 1,100 people for 60 days after a nuclear attack. It would never be used for its intended purpose. And in 1992, a single journalist's investigation would expose it to the world and render it useless overnight. The story of how this bunker was conceived, built, maintained in absolute secrecy, and ultimately exposed is a story about Cold War paranoia, institutional secrecy, continuity of government planning, and the psychological burden carried by ordinary people who kept extraordinary secrets for decades. Before we reveal how this massive secret was maintained for over 3 decades and the investigation that would finally expose it, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these deeply researched Cold War investigations every week, uncovering the documented truth behind history's most closely guarded secrets. The Greenbrier Resort had been operating in various forms since 1778. When a small inn was built near Natural Sulphur Springs in the Allegheny Mountains of West Virginia. By the 1950s, it had evolved into one of America's most prestigious luxury hotels, covering 11,000 acres with championship golf courses, extensive gardens, and accommodations for more than 800 guests. The clientele included presidents, foreign dignitaries, business executives, and wealthy families. 26 American presidents would stay at the resort over its history. During World War II, the property had been converted into an army hospital, where President Dwight D. Eisenhower had visited wounded soldiers on several occasions. The government already had a relationship with the Greenbrier. The origins of the congressional bunker lie in the escalating nuclear arms race of the mid-1950s. By that time, American military and civilian leaders understood that the Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them to American cities. A Soviet nuclear attack on Washington, D.C. would likely destroy the Capitol building, the White House, the Pentagon, and most of the federal government's leadership in minutes. The question of governmental continuity, how to preserve some functioning version of the constitutional government after a decapitating nuclear strike, became a priority for national security planning. In August 1955, President Eisenhower met with congressional leadership. Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, House Minority Leader Joseph Martin, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, and Senate Minority Leader William Knowland. According to declassified records, Eisenhower urged these men to plan for the legislative branch's continuity in the event of a national emergency. The leaders agreed on the necessity for a relocation site, but decided to keep the process classified. In 1955, Eisenhower instructed the Department of Defense to draft emergency plans for Congress in case of a nuclear strike. The Army Corps of Engineers was charged with scouting locations for a nuclear bunker for members of Congress. They identified approximately 6 suitable sites. According to Robert Conte, who would later become the Greenbrier's official historian, the resort was chosen for several specific reasons. Its location fell within the geographic parameters of the Federal Relocation Arc, the same area that housed other government emergency facilities like Mount Weather in Virginia and Site R in Pennsylvania. It was protected by surrounding mountains. It was accessible by various modes of transportation, including a nearby railway line and an airport approximately 5 miles away. It had an existing physical plant to support a large facility, and crucially, the government already had a relationship with the resort from its use during World War II. The proximity to Washington was calculated precisely. The Greenbrier sat approximately 250 miles from the capital, far enough to be outside the immediate blast radius of a nuclear attack on Washington, but close enough that evacuated members of Congress could theoretically reach it within 4 hours if provided with adequate transportation and warning. On March 26, 1956, President Eisenhower visited the Greenbrier. The purpose of this visit, according to later accounts, was to personally assess the site's suitability for the congressional bunker project. Construction began in late 1958. The project was given the code name Project Casper, which would later be changed to Project Greek Island. The cover story, developed in coordination with the resort's management, emphasized growing demand for corporate convention space. The Greenbrier would announce construction of a new wing, the West Virginia Wing, containing meeting rooms, office space, and expanded facilities for conferences and events. This was not entirely false. The visible portion of the construction would indeed produce functional conference space that the hotel would use for legitimate business. But beneath those visible floors would be 2 underground levels containing the bunker itself. The Greenbrier's owners, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, agreed to cooperate with the government project. According to documents declassified after the bunker's exposure, the railway company was compensated for construction costs and agreed to maintain the facility under a long-term contract with the federal government. The construction method used was called cut and cover. Workers excavated an enormous pit, what Randy Wickline would describe as a cavernous hole carved out of shale, using scrapers, rippers, and air hammers. Then they poured concrete into that excavation to create the bunker structure before covering it with earth and constructing the visible hotel wing above it. Wickline remembered the urgency of the work. His supervisor would holler, "Hurry up," even instructing him to push the legal weight limit on his truckloads and paying the fines that resulted. To keep pace with the demand, Superior Supply Company had to purchase 2 additional concrete mixers and still struggled to meet the schedule. Cost was never an issue, Wickline recalled. Over 2.5 years, the company hauled approximately 4,000 loads of concrete to the site. The bunker's specifications were extraordinary. The facility covered approximately 112,544 square feet, roughly the size of 2 football fields stacked on top of each other. The walls were 2 feet thick, made of reinforced concrete. The structure was buried 720 feet into the hillside, with the roof located 20 feet below ground level. While the bunker could not survive a direct nuclear strike, it was designed to withstand a blast 15 to 30 miles away and to protect its occupants from radioactive fallout. The bunker had 4 blast doors, all manufactured by the Mosler Safe Company in Ohio and shipped to the Greenbrier by railway. The 2 largest doors, designated GH1 and GH3, weighed 28 tons and 20 tons respectively. Despite their massive weight, they were engineered to move with just 50 pounds of pressure, allowing even a single person to open or close them. The doors were 19.5 inches thick, Once sealed, they would create an airtight barrier against radiation and biological or chemical weapons. The facility's layout reflected its dual purpose, to serve as a meeting space for Congress during normal times and as a survival shelter during nuclear war. The largest space, called the Exhibit Hall, was designed to host joint sessions of Congress. During the bunker's active years, this hall was actually used by the Greenbrier as a conference facility, with guests walking through it daily without knowing they were inside a nuclear bunker. A Greenbrier brochure from the 1960s advertised the hall to potential clients, noting that the floor is finished with a beautiful plastic terrazzo designed to support unlimited weight. Adjacent to the exhibit hall were two smaller auditoriums: Governor's Hall, with 440 seats intended for the House of Representatives, and the Mountaineer Room, with 130 seats for the Senate. Construction workers noticed peculiarities that suggested something beyond ordinary conference facilities. One contractor, examining the men's restrooms being installed, reportedly asked resort manager Truman Wright, "This is an exhibit hall? We've got 110 urinals we just installed. What in the hell are you going to exhibit?" Behind concealed doors marked with warnings like "Danger," "High voltage, keep out," the rest of the bunker extended into areas the public never saw. These hidden sections contained decontamination rooms where arriving members of Congress would strip, shower, and change into uncontaminated clothing. There were dormitories with 18 rooms, each designed to house 60 people in metal bunk beds arranged in rows, a total capacity of 1,100 beds. There was a kitchen and a 400-seat cafeteria, at one point decorated with fake windows featuring scenic outdoor views to create the illusion of normalcy in the underground space. There was a medical clinic with examination rooms, dental equipment, and basic surgical facilities. There was a broadcast studio from which legislators could address what was left of the nation after nuclear war. There was a pathological waste incinerator designed to dispose of bodies of those who died from radiation exposure. There were vast water storage tanks and enough food supplies to feed 1,000 people for 60 days. The bunker's air filtration system was extraordinarily sophisticated, designed to filter out radioactive particles, chemical agents, and biological contaminants from outside air. The system was so powerful it created a vacuum-like effect when the doors opened, causing wind to howl through corridors and suck doors shut. Once sealed, the bunker would have enough air to last 72 hours before the ventilation system would need to begin filtering outside air. A complete telecommunications center contained 3 generations of telephone technology. The communications system was designed to allow the bunker to maintain contact with military commanders and the executive branch. All calls placed from the bunker would be routed through the hotel's switchboard to make it appear they originated from the resort rather than from an underground facility. The bunker was officially declared completed on October 16, 1962, at the outset of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Almost immediately, the facility was placed on high alert. Crates containing original government manuscripts were shipped to the site by the architect of the Capitol. The bunker would never be fully activated during its 30-year existence, but it remained in a constant state of readiness. Maintaining that readiness required full-time staff. The solution to this operational challenge became one of the bunker's most effective deceptions. A front company called Forsyth Associates was created, ostensibly based in Arlington, Virginia. According to official records, Forsyth Associates was a management and electronic consulting firm that had contracted with the Greenbrier to provide audio and video support services to the hotel. Between 12 and 15 government employees worked at the Greenbrier under this cover, maintaining the hotel's more than 1,100 televisions and maintaining the bunker. The first manager of Forsyth Associates was John Landis, a former cryptographic expert with the Army Signal Corps who had previously worked at Mount Weather, another government emergency facility. Landis held a top-secret security clearance and had been stationed at the Pentagon before taking the Greenbrier assignment. He moved to White Sulphur Springs with his wife and integrated into the local community, presenting himself as a television repair company manager. In 1970, Landis was replaced by Paul Fritz Bugas, who would manage the bunker for the next 22 years until its exposure in 1992. Bugas, a compact and energetic man who had served 2 decades in military intelligence, became the face of Forsyth Associates in White Sulphur Springs. When people asked what he did, Bugas would explain he was the regional manager of Forsyth Associates and would describe the company as providing audio-visual support to the Greenbrier. The personnel who worked for him, he would say, maintained the resort's electronic equipment. This cover story was not entirely false. According to Bugas's later testimony, the Forsyth staff spent approximately 15 to 20% of their time actually doing television repair and maintenance work for the hotel. The remaining 80% of their time was devoted to maintaining the bunker. They tested generators monthly, they inspected air filtration systems, they replaced water filters, they rotated food supplies, removing expired items and replacing them with fresh stock. They updated pharmaceutical supplies, they maintained plumbing and electrical systems, they ensured communications equipment remained functional. They updated congressional assignments for the bunker's 1,100 beds as members of Congress came and went through elections. For 30 years, every one of these 1,100 beds was assigned to somebody, Bob Conte would later explain. For that 30 years, you had to make sure all the filters were changed, all the pharmaceuticals were up to date, and all the food was ready to go. The Forsyth employees lived in various towns in Greenbrier County: White Sulphur Springs, Lewisburg, Ronceverte, Alderson. They functioned like ordinary members of the community. They had jobs at the Greenbrier, lived where they chose in the Greenbrier Valley, came to work, and performed their duties. To neighbors, to hotel staff, to the thousands of guests who stayed at the resort each year, they appeared to be television repair technicians. Bugas lived with the peculiar psychological burden of maintaining absolute secrecy while participating in normal community life. He could not discuss his real work with friends, neighbors, or even close associates. The secret was so closely held that when Bob Conte arrived at the Greenbrier as the resort's official historian in 1978, even he was not told about the bunker's existence. Conte became friends with Fritz Bugas and found it strange that while all other Greenbrier workers, electricians, cooks, plumbers, were employees of the resort, the Forsyth staff were contractors. Conte was right to be suspicious, but he would not learn the truth until 1992. The people of White Sulphur Springs and the surrounding Greenbrier Valley maintained what amounted to a collective silence about the bunker. Many locals had worked on the construction or had noticed the unusual volume of concrete, the massive blast doors, the excessive number of men's restrooms, the airport runway that seemed too long for a town of 3,000 people. Parents warned their children against loose talk about what they might have seen or heard. One local resident, Ann Tate Bell, whose father ran the Greenbrier Valley Airport, recalled an incident during construction when her brother and his friends, while riding bikes near the building site, were offered a ride in a fancy new elevator by a construction worker. At dinner that night, when her brother excitedly described the elevator ride, their father, who held a government security clearance, was horrified. He called the other children's parents and gave all the boys a stern lecture about secrecy and the importance of never discussing what they had seen. Everyone just agreed to be in on the secret, Bell would later recall. During the winters, when the hotel might house as few as 100 guests, Bugas would supervise dry runs that brought up to 50 hotel employees and perhaps another 100 outside specialists into the bunker. The facility would be sealed off for 12 to 16 hours while staff tested equipment. They could not run these drills any longer without disrupting the hotel's routine and creating suspicions. Stability was a big thing, Bugas explained in later interviews. Almost no members of Congress knew about the bunker's existence. Only the congressional leadership was briefed. Former Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill recalled being told about the evacuation plan. "I never mentioned it to anybody, but every time I went down to the Greenbrier, I always used to look at the hill and say, well, that's where we're supposed to live in the event something happens, and that's where we're going to do business, maybe under the tennis courts." There remained ambiguity about whether members of Congress would be allowed to bring their families to the bunker. O'Neill recalled being told he could not bring his family, commenting, "I kind of lost interest in it when they told me my wife would not be going with me." Bugas maintained there were plans to expand bunker facilities to accommodate families, though it remains unclear if this expansion ever occurred. Presidents and vice presidents who visited the Greenbrier likely knew about the bunker. President Gerald Ford and Vice President Hubert Humphrey visited frequently enough to draw attention. According to John Landis, Humphrey toured the bunker under cover of darkness and was very satisfied that if the need ever occurred, we had the necessary capabilities. The bunker's existence depended on secrecy. The evacuation plan assumed that there would be warning of an incoming Soviet attack from early warning radar detecting missiles or from intelligence indicating an imminent strike. It assumed this warning would provide enough time to transport members of Congress from Washington to West Virginia by helicopter and vehicle convoy. It assumed transportation would be available and highways navigable. Many defense analysts considered these assumptions optimistic at best, but the plan's practical effectiveness was less important than its symbolic function. The bunker represented a commitment to governmental continuity, a tangible assertion that American democracy would survive even nuclear war. For 30 years, the bunker remained secret and ready. The Greenbrier continued to operate as a luxury resort, hosting thousands of guests annually who had no idea what lay beneath their feet. Corporate conventions were held in the exhibit hall. Weddings and anniversaries were celebrated in spaces directly above dormitories filled with metal bunk beds. Golf tournaments were played on courses where members of Congress would theoretically land in helicopters during an emergency evacuation. And below it all, Fritz Bugas and his staff continued their quiet work, testing systems that were never used, maintaining a facility that remained perpetually ready but perpetually dormant, living with a secret they could share with almost no one. The end of the bunker's secrecy came not from any security breach by government officials or maintenance workers, but from investigative journalism. In early 1992, Ted Gupp, a 44-year-old reporter for the Washington Post, began investigating rumors he had heard about a secret government facility at the Greenbrier. Gupp had been working as an investigative journalist for more than 2 decades, covering intelligence agencies, classified programs, and government secrecy. He had developed sources within the national security community and had learned to pursue stories involving classified information without violating laws or endangering national security. The initial tip came from an anonymous source who suggested there was something interesting beneath the West Virginia resort. Gupp began researching, examining corporate records, construction contracts, and property documents. He conducted interviews with former employees and people who had worked in the area during the construction period. The breakthrough came when Gupp located retired construction workers who had been involved in the West Virginia Wing project in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Several of these workers, now in their 60s and 70s, had signed confidentiality agreements decades earlier, but were willing to discuss the project in general terms. Randy Wickline provided detailed descriptions of the unusual scale of the concrete work. Other workers described the massive blast doors, the air filtration systems, the excessive number of restrooms, details that confirmed Gupp's suspicion that a bunker existed beneath the resort. Gupp also obtained architectural and engineering documents through public records requests. While the most sensitive documents remained classified, some records related to the construction project had been filed with local building authorities and were accessible. In early 1992, Gupp visited the Greenbrier. "One of the most memorable moments of my life," Bob Conte would later recall, was Gupp coming and putting a tape recorder on my desk and saying, "I'm here to talk about what's under the West Virginia wing." Conte, who still did not know the truth himself despite being the resort's historian for 14 years, gave Gupp the official line. Rumors had always circulated about the Greenbrier, but they were just that, rumors. Gupp contacted members of Congress who he believed would have been briefed about the facility. He reached several retired members who confirmed, off the record, that they had been told about an emergency relocation facility at the Greenbrier during their time in office. The Washington Post published Gupp's article on May 31, 1992. The article ran on the front page of the Washington Post magazine under the headline, "The Last Resort." The piece provided detailed information about the bunker's history, construction, purpose, and maintenance. While Gupp had not been granted access to photograph the interior of the bunker, the article included photographs of the Greenbrier and the West Virginia wing, along with detailed descriptions based on his interviews with sources. For Fritz Bugas and the other Forsyth Associates employees, the exposure was devastating. When the Washington Post broke the story, Bugas would later recall, "My immediate feeling and reaction was one of devastation. The hurt was not only felt by me, but by all on-site government employees. We felt a disservice had been done. I'm not talking to us personally, but to our country's security. We felt very strongly about what we had been doing. We had maintained and kept operational a facility ready for occupancy by the legislative branch of the government to be used in the event of a national crisis. The facility was very much in a constant state of readiness. We took great pride in what we did. When all this was exposed in the newspaper, it obviously hurt us a great deal. For government officials and security planners, the exposure created an immediate operational problem. Once the facility's existence and location were publicly known, it could no longer serve its intended purpose. Any potential adversary now knew exactly where Congress would attempt to relocate in a nuclear emergency, making the facility a target rather than a refuge. Within days of the article's publication, government officials acknowledged that the facility could no longer be used for its original purpose and would be decommissioned. Immediately after the Post story ran, the bunker was formally closed as a classified government installation. Gupp defended his decision to publish. He argued that by 1992, with the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union dissolved, the bunker was essentially obsolete. The bunker was built when bombers took hours to go over the polar ice caps, Gupp explained. The warning time was many hours. We're now talking minutes, if not less. He believed the public interest in knowing about a government facility built with taxpayer money outweighed any remaining security concerns. The Greenbrier's management, after conferring with government officials, made the decision to preserve the facility and convert it into a tourist attraction. In 1995, the resort began offering guided tours of the bunker, marketing it as a Cold War historical site. Many of the Forsyth Associates employees, including Fritz Bugas, were hired by the hotel to work as tour guides or to help transition the facility to its new public role. The tours proved extraordinarily popular. Visitors could walk through the exhibit hall where Congress would have met, examine the dormitories with their metal bunk beds, see the medical clinic, inspect the blast doors, and learn about the telecommunications systems. The bunker, which had been built to be invisible and had remained secret for 34 years, became one of the Greenbrier's most distinctive features. Fritz Bugas, who had maintained the secret for more than 2 decades, found himself explaining the facility to thousands of visitors. He conducted tours for high-profile guests, including former President George H.W. Bush and former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. He even cordially showed the bunker to his old nemesis Ted Gupp. Bugas remained proud of the various ways the bunker's existence had been camouflaged. He would point out details visitors might have missed. The small green building with a danger, high-voltage sign that appeared to house a transformer but actually concealed the bunker's air intake facility. The white warehouse near the stables, where guests asking about it were told it was storage space when it actually held Forsyth's office and bunker supplies. For the construction workers who had built the facility decades earlier, the exposure brought a mixture of vindication and reflection. Randy Wickline, who had spent 2.5 years hauling concrete and wondering what he was building, finally had confirmation of what he had long suspected. The scale of the work, the urgency, the cost, all of it made sense in retrospect. For Bob Conte, the Greenbrier's historian who had spent 14 years noticing strange details without knowing their explanation, the revelation was illuminating. The excessive number of men's bathrooms, the unusually long airport runway, the mysterious Forsyth Associates contractors who worked at the hotel, but not for the hotel, all the peculiarities that had troubled him suddenly made perfect sense. The bunker's exposure also affected the broader community of White Sulphur Springs. Residents who had kept the secret for decades could finally discuss openly what they had long known or suspected. Parents could explain to adult children why they had been warned never to talk about what they saw during construction. Workers who had held security clearances could acknowledge their role in one of the Cold War's most successful deception operations. The story of the Greenbrier bunker raises questions about secrecy, democracy, and the Cold War's impact on American society. For more than 3 decades, hundreds of people kept a secret about a facility that existed beneath a public resort. Construction workers, maintenance staff, government officials, members of Congress, and ordinary residents of White Sulphur Springs all maintained silence about what they knew or suspected. They did so because they believed the secret served a legitimate national security purpose, or because they were legally required to maintain confidentiality, or because they feared consequences of disclosure, or because, in the words of Ann Tate Bell, everyone just agreed to be in on the secret. The question of whether this secrecy was justified is complicated. From a national security perspective, the bunker could only serve its purpose if its location remained unknown. Disclosure would make the facility a target, negating its protective value. But from a democratic accountability perspective, the existence of a facility designed to protect government officials at taxpayer expense, while the broader population would have no similar protection, raises questions about equity, transparency, and the relationship between citizens and their government. The maintenance workers occupy a particularly complex position in this story. They were ordinary working people who happened to be employed maintaining an extraordinary facility. They were not high-level government officials making policy decisions about nuclear war planning. They were technicians and electricians who tested generators and replaced filters. But their work was essential to the bunker's functionality, and their silence was essential to its secrecy. Fritz Bugas lived for more than 20 years with knowledge he could not share with most of the community around him. He went to work each day in a facility designed for a scenario he hoped would never occur. He participated in preparing for nuclear war while maintaining relationships and living in a small town where such preparations seemed remote and abstract. The psychological compartmentalization required, maintaining the secret while maintaining normal life, demanded sustained cognitive discipline. For the members of Congress who were briefed about the facility, the knowledge created ethical complications. They knew they had access to protection their constituents did not. They knew that in a nuclear emergency, they would be evacuated to safety while the people who had elected them would face nuclear war without similar refuge. Some members were deeply uncomfortable with this disparity. Tip O'Neill's comment about losing interest when told his wife couldn't accompany him suggests the moral weight of knowing he would survive while his family would not. The exposure of the bunker in 1992 came at a particular historical moment, shortly after the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the nuclear threat that had justified the bunker's construction seemed to be receding. This changed context influenced both Gupp's investigation and the Post's decision to publish. In the 1960s or 1970s, at the height of Cold War tensions, it is unlikely that a major newspaper would have published information about a secret congressional bunker. But by 1992, with the Soviet Union dissolved and the immediate threat of nuclear war diminished, the calculation shifted. The Greenbrier bunker never served its intended purpose. Congress was never evacuated there. The scenarios that planners had envisioned, Soviet missiles detected by early warning systems, emergency notifications sent to members of Congress, convoys of vehicles and helicopters transporting legislators from Washington to West Virginia, never occurred. The bunker remained a potentiality, a preparation for a catastrophe that did not happen. Whether this represents success or failure depends on perspective. From one angle, the bunker was a waste of resources, $14 million spent constructing and maintaining a facility that was never used. From another angle, the bunker was part of a larger system of deterrence and preparation that may have contributed to preventing the nuclear war it was designed to survive. But measuring the bunker's success or failure by whether it was used misses a deeper point. The bunker's existence affected the people involved with it in ways that had nothing to do with its operational use. Randy Wickline, hauling concrete in 1960, recognized he was building something designed to survive nuclear war, and that recognition shaped how he thought about the world. Fritz Bugas, maintaining the facility for 22 years, lived with daily reminders of nuclear vulnerability while raising a family and participating in community life. Members of Congress, briefed about the facility, carried knowledge about their own potential survival in scenarios where most of their constituents would die. The bunker shaped consciousness, created secrets, imposed silences, and generated a particular kind of Cold War awareness, a way of living with the knowledge of nuclear weapons and nuclear vulnerability while maintaining the routines of normal life. This psychological and social impact was the bunker's real consequence, regardless of whether it ever housed a single member of Congress during an actual emergency. The question raised by the Greenbrier case is how to think about the gap between legal responsibility and moral complexity. The bunker's construction and maintenance were legal, authorized at the highest levels of government, carried out by contractors and employees following lawful orders. But the ethical dimensions are more complicated. Should resources have been spent protecting government officials while ordinary citizens had no similar protection? Should such a facility have been kept secret from the public whose tax dollars funded it? Should maintenance workers have been required to keep secrets from their families and communities for decades? These questions have no simple answers. They require acknowledging multiple truths simultaneously, that individuals bear responsibility for their choices, and that those choices are made within contexts that shape what options seem available and what consequences seem real. That secrecy sometimes serves legitimate security purposes, and that secrecy also shields government operations from democratic accountability. That preparations for nuclear war were both reasonable precautions and manifestations of paranoia. Fritz Bugas retired in 1995 after the final materials were removed from the bunker and it transitioned to a public attraction. He continued to live in White Sulphur Springs, occasionally giving tours and interviews about his decades maintaining the facility. He remained proud of the work he and his colleagues had done, even as he acknowledged the emotional toll of the bunker's exposure. He passed away in 2025 at the age of 96, having spent more than half a century keeping and then explaining one of the Cold War's most successful secrets. Bob Conte, the Greenbrier's historian, continued working at the resort and became one of the leading authorities on the bunker's history. He gave countless interviews, wrote extensively about the facility, and helped preserve the historical record of Project Greek Island. He and Bugas became close friends, bonded by their shared connection to the bunker, Conte as the historian who hadn't known about it, Bugas as the manager who had maintained it in secrecy. Randy Wickline, the construction worker who had poured concrete into what he knew was no ordinary building, lived to see his suspicions confirmed when the bunker was exposed. His quote, "A fool would have known," captured the reality that many people involved with the project understood at some level what they were building, even if they couldn't say it aloud. Ted Gupp, the journalist who exposed the bunker, continued working as an investigative reporter and author. He later became a professor of journalism at Case Western Reserve University and wrote The Book of Honor, Covert Lives and Classified Deaths at the CIA. He defended his decision to publish the story throughout his career, arguing that transparency and democratic accountability ultimately outweighed the security value of a bunker that was already obsolete by 1992. The Greenbrier continues to operate as a luxury resort, and the bunker tours remain one of its most popular attractions. Visitors can book tours for approximately $40 and walk through the same spaces that were designed to house Congress during nuclear war. The facility has been preserved much as it was in 1992, though most of the original furnishings were removed when the bunker was decommissioned. The resort has installed period furnishings to approximate what the bunker looked like during its operational years. 2 of the original bunk beds remain in the dormitories. The massive blast doors still function, and tour guides still demonstrate their operation. But the bunker's transformation from secret facility to tourist attraction represents a broader transformation in American culture's relationship with the Cold War. What was once urgent and secret is now historical and public. What was once preparation for possible catastrophe is now educational entertainment. The threat that justified the bunker's construction has receded, though nuclear weapons and nuclear dangers remain. The facility designed to preserve governmental continuity in the aftermath of nuclear war now serves to preserve historical memory of the era when such preparations seemed necessary. The Greenbrier bunker was conceived in 1955, construction began in 1958, it was completed in 1962, and it was exposed in 1992. For 34 years it existed in secrecy, maintained by people who could not discuss their work, designed for a purpose that was never fulfilled, ready for a catastrophe that did not come. And in those 34 years, It shaped the lives and consciousness of everyone involved with it, from Randy Wickline hauling concrete and knowing he was building something designed to survive the unthinkable, to Fritz Bugas testing generators month after month while the world above continued its ordinary operations, to members of Congress who knew they had an escape plan their constituents did not, to the people of White Sulphur Springs who kept a collective secret and took pride in their patriotic silence. The bunker beneath the Greenbrier stands now as a monument to a particular moment in American history, a time when the threat of nuclear annihilation shaped government planning, when secrecy was considered essential to national security, when preparations for catastrophe coexisted with luxury and normalcy, and when ordinary people working in construction or maintenance or government service found themselves participating in systems designed for scenarios they hoped would never occur. The physical space has been preserved, the secret has been revealed, but the human dimensions of what it meant to build, maintain, and keep silent about a nuclear bunker for 34 years persist in the memories of those who lived through it and in the questions it raises about secrecy, democracy, and the costs of preparing for wars we hope never to fight.